Hi, friends. I tend to be long-winded, so I'm going to try to make this short and share with you 5 key learnings that I've had in 2020 in 5 minutes or less. So the first thing that I've learned this year is to trust my intuition. On May 29th of this year, I left my corporate job to start my own business. I really had nothing but a few ideas, and I learned although the fear of that led up to making that decision and even the fear after I made that decision was real, that I trusted my intuition and it has shown fruits, even in this short amount of time. And one quote that I wanted to share with you on that is from Gisele Bündchen, and she says, quote, "The more you trust your intuition, the more empowered you become, the stronger you become, and the happier you become," end quote. Number two, the other lesson I learned is that it is quite possible for me to hold joy and sorrow and grief at the same time. There was a lot of suffering and death and sorrow that happened in this unprecedented year. It was also a year that I intentionally chose to cultivate joy in my life. And I found myself oftentimes feeling guilty or uncomfortable, feeling joyful when there's so much suffering around me. And so that's just one thing that I learned this year, is to hold both of those at the same time. And that doesn't mean that something's wrong with me. It means I'm human. Number three is just another idea that has been reinforced for me, is that this anti-racist work, it is so critical that we know ourselves, the good and the ugly, and know where we come from. I've read and learned about generational trauma, that it is generational and can be passed down generation by generation. But I didn't know until this year that resilience is also generational, and that gave me power and hope. I think it was Aristotle that said, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And so sometimes if knowing ourselves is scary, just remember that it is important in anti-racist work. One other quote I wanted to share is from Ijeoma Oluo, she is the author of So You Want to Talk About Race. She says, quote, "You have to get over the fear of facing the worst in yourself. You should instead fear unexamined racism. Fear the thought that right now you could be contributing to the oppression of others and don't know it. But do not fear those who bring that oppression to light. Do not fear the opportunity to do better." The fourth thing that I learned this year is that we are all connected. And if this year in the midst of a pandemic did not teach me this, I don't know what did. That when there is an unhealthy part of the system, we all suffer in one way or another. And just the example of us needing to stay home or to wear masks when we go out so that we do not get others sick. It is not just about protecting ourselves and our families, but it is also the stranger that could have an underlying condition or that could be disenfranchised in other ways by a system of oppression. One quote I wanted to share that I thought really spoke to me this year is by Zenju Erlin Manuel. She says, quote, "The nature of suffering within systemic oppression is that we are conditioned to not see each other and to act on our lives as individual beings rather than collective. This conditioning leads to not knowing who we are with each other, and the confusion and ignorance is not understanding this interrelationship, which leads directly to comparison, notions of superior and inferiority, and ultimately acts of hatred," end quote. And the final thing that I think is a reinforced learning, but also wanted just to share with everybody, is that racial justice and equity is not a trend. We saw this happen again this year when we saw all publicly the tragic lynching of George Floyd and what followed in the protests. We saw an increase in anti-racist books being bought. We saw an increase in the number of book studies and book clubs happening. And now as we get to the end of the year, we've seen that trending down. So I just wanted this as a reminder to myself and to everyone else that racial justice, anti-racist work, racial equity is something that all of us have a responsibility for. And I think if all of us recognize the truth that our liberation depends on the liberation of our neighbor, that racism is killing all of us, if we all knew that we had a dog in the fight, what power would that have? So I wanted to end with another quote from Ijeoma Oluo, the author of So You Want to Talk About Race. And she says, quote, "Act now, because people are dying now in this unjust system. How many lives have been ground up by racial prejudice and hate? How many opportunities have we already lost? Act and talk and learn and F up and learn some more and act again and do better. We have to do this all at once. We have to learn and fight at the same time because people have been waiting far too long for their chance to live as equals in this society, end quote. So just to sum up, my 5 learnings is 1, trust my intuition. 2, it's human to be able to hold joy and sorrow and grief at the same time. 3, critical self-reflection and knowing ourselves, the good and the ugly, is critical to anti-racist work. 4, we are all connected and our liberation depends on each other's liberation. And finally, racial justice and equity is not a trend. It is hard work. It causes us sometimes to lose hope, but we must not give up the fight and not give up the focus. And we all play a role in that. So I hope you all have a wonderful end to 2020 and that you walk into 2021 feeling renewed, refreshed, and hopeful. And I can't wait to continue this work with you in the new year.